Lisa Monroe and Ryan Carter looked like an ordinary young couple, but within 48 hours, their lives would unravel in two. Nightmare of jealousy, violence, and deception. She was a 23-year-old student with a bright future, and he was the boyfriend desperate to keep control as their relationship crumbled. What began as a quiet weekend together ended with Lisa's brutal death and Ryan's chilling attempt to rewrite reality. For 2 days, he spun a web of lie-sending fake messages, staging her absence and scrubbing every trace of the crime, believing he could outsmart everyone. But each step only drew investigators closer, turning his 48 hours of deception into the very evidence that exposed him. Lisa Monroe's life seemed ordinary from the outside. The kind of quiet, simple existence that rarely raised questions or suspicions. At 23, she was balancing a part-time job at a local bookstore with classes at a nearby community college. Friends described her as dependable, the type of person who always answered calls and never backed out of plans. When her boyfriend, Ryan Carter, suggested spending the weekend together at her apartment, Lisa thought little of it. Their relationship had been strained in recent weeks. Arguments sparked by Ryan's unpredictable moods and his growing resentment over Lisa's decision to focus more on her studies and less on him. But Ryan had promised her a calm weekend. Just the two of them, a chance to ease the tension and remind each other why they had started dating in the first place. On Friday afternoon, neighbors saw them at the grocery store. The two carried bags filled with snacks, soda, and a bottle of cheap wine. They looked like any young couple planning to relax for a couple of days. To the outside world, it was a picture of normalcy. Nothing alarming. Nothing to suggest the storm that was about to unfold behind closed doors. Inside, however, Ryan's mind was spiraling. He had recently lost his job at a warehouse, and bills were piling up. He had borrowed money from friends and family and lied to Lisa about his financial situation. That evening, when she quietly admitted that she was thinking about ending the relationship, the thin line holding Ryan's world together snapped. What happened inside the apartment that night was quick but violent. Ryan's temper had always lurked beneath the surface, and in that moment of rejection, it erupted. Lisa never had a chance to defend herself. Within minutes, her apartment, once filled with the quiet hum of weekend plans, became the scene of a crime Ryan could not undo. He stood over her, panicked and breathless, realizing the weight of what he had done. The silence that followed felt unbearable, a silence broken only by the distant sounds of life outside, the rumble of cars on the street, the laughter of neighbors, the ordinary rhythms that contrasted cruelly with the horror in the room. As the hours passed, Ryan's fear shifted into calculation. He convinced himself he could fix what had happened, that he could erase it somehow. Instead of calling the police, instead of reaching out for help, he chose deception. He told himself it was the only way to survive, that no one would believe it was a mistake. He sat in the apartment through the night, his mind racing, replaying the scene again and again, but always circling back to the same conclusion he had. To hide the truth, by early morning, he began taking the first steps of his plan. He scrolled through Lisa's phone, reading her last messages, memorizing her recent conversations. He thought if he played his role carefully enough, people would assume she was still alive. He drafted texts to friends in her tone, short and casual, the kind Lisa might have written on a busy morning. Then he walked through the apartment, eyeing every corner for signs that could betray him. The shattered glass on the floor, the small drops on the rug, the misplaced objects. He told himself he would clean it all. The sun rose outside, filling the neighborhood with warm light, but inside the apartment, Ryan moved in shadows. He had crossed a line he could never retreat from, and as much as he tried to convince himself he was in control, fear gnawed at him. He had just begun the performance of his life, one that would last for 48 hours, a performance built on lies and desperation, a fragile mask covering the crime he could not undo. His first instinct after the night of violence was not to run, but to create a story, one that would buy him time and distance from suspicion. He told himself that if he could make Lisa appear alive in the eyes of her friends and family, then no one would look too closely at him. He sat on her bed in the gray light of morning, scrolling through her phone, piecing together the rhythm of her daily communication. He studied the way she wrote her messages, short phrases, casual emojis, always polite but never overly detailed. Mimicking her tone became his new task, as though by capturing her voice on a screen, he could convince the world that she was still moving, still breathing. The first message he sent was to one of her close friends. It was brief, a simple excuse. About being busy with errands? Minutes later, he followed it with another to her sister, claiming she needed some quiet time away. When no immediate suspicion came back, Ryan felt a jolt of relief. The lies worked, at least for now. He paced the apartment, rehearsing what he might say if someone knocked at the door. What excuse he might give if Lisa's family called. Apartment, though, betrayed him in small ways. The heavy scent in the air, the stains that resisted his hurried scrubbing, and the silence that hung too thickly reminded him of the truth he was trying so hard to bury. As the hours slipped away, Ryan focused on removing evidence. He gathered clothing, bedding, and towels into garbage bags, dragging them down the back stairwell so neighbors would not notice. Each trip was deliberate, each bag heavier than the last, filled not only with objects, but with the weight of his growing paranoia. He drove them to a distant dumpster, convinced that distance meant safety. In his mind, every item carried a risk, a potential clue that could point straight back to him. By discarding them, he believed he was erasing the night, one trip at a time. Later that afternoon, Ryan sat in Lisa's car, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. He realized he needed to go further. If people saw movement, if they saw her car, then the illusion of her presence would grow stronger. He started the engine and drove aimlessly through town. Security cameras captured the vehicle passing through. Intersections, parked outside small shops, even idling near the grocery store. To anyone reviewing the footage later, it would appear Lisa was still out in the world, conducting her ordinary routines. What those cameras did not capture was the absence that screamed louder than any presence Lisa herself. Back at the apartment, Ryan's nerves sharpened. Could not silence the feeling that eyes were on him, that neighbors sensed something was off. He had smiled at them the day before, carried bags of snacks with Lisa by his side. Now he was alone, closing curtains, moving about the apartment with frantic energy. To cover his tracks, he went further, scrubbing countertops, mopping the floors, rearranging furniture to mask the marks he could not erase. The smell of cleaning products mixed with something metallic, leaving a strange, unsettling odor that clung to the rooms. He convinced himself it was enough, that no one would notice. That night, Ryan's thoughts grew darker. The lies were not just words on a phone anymore. They had become a fragile world he was building brick by brick. He believed that if he could maintain control for another day, the questions would fade, suspicions would scatter, and life would continue. Yet deep inside, he sensed the cracks forming. Lisa's friends were persistent, her family more so. Expected her voice, not just typed words. They wanted her laughter on the phone, her warmth in person. Ryan knew he could not deliver that, no matter how carefully he staged his story. The first 24 hours ended with Ryan lying awake, staring at the ceiling of Lisa's apartment. Every sound outside made him flinch. Every buzz of the phone sent a wave of dread through his body. His lies had bought him time, but each second was also a countdown leading toward a truth he could not escape. The plan he thought was clever was already unraveling, though he had not yet realized how quickly it would come crashing down. By the time the second day began, Ryan was convinced he had grown into the role of puppeteer, pulling invisible strings. To make it appear that Lisa was still alive, the lies no longer felt like improvisations. They became a performance he rehearsed in his head, refining each detail until he believed his own version of events. That morning, he borrowed Lisa's car again and drove it through different neighborhoods, making sure to be seen. He parked it outside a coffee shop for nearly half an hour, slouched low in the seat, imagining how it would look to passersby. To anyone watching, it would appear that Lisa had simply stepped inside for a drink, blending into the ordinary life of strangers. No, but the car remained empty, a hollow stand-in for a life that had been cut short. His need for control pushed him further. He knew her workplace expected her to arrive on Monday, and the thought of people raising alarms unsettled him. So he scribbled a note in her handwriting, shaky and unnatural, claiming she needed personal time. The lie, folded neatly and dropped at her desk, was a desperate attempt to buy more hours. He convinced himself that coworkers would read the note, nod with understanding, and move on with their day. Yet he underestimated how quickly suspicion grows when someone dependable suddenly disappears. Back at the apartment, Ryan's cleaning had turned obsessive. He poured bleach across the bathroom tiles and scrubbed until his arms ached, the pungent smell clinging to his skin and clothes. He ripped up a rug from the living room, rolled it tightly, and shoved it into the trunk of Lisa's car before driving it to another dumpster. Each act felt like progress, but the stains that resisted him became a silent reminder that the truth was not so easily erased. The more he tried to cover, the more evidence seemed to appear. A faint discoloration on the carpet, smear on the baseboard. The metallic odor of something that no amount of cleaning solution could fully disguise. Fear seeped into every corner of his thoughts. Yet Ryan forced himself to keep up the act. He returned to Lisa's phone, sending out another round of messages. This time, though, he made mistakes. The timing of her responses was off, too abrupt, too out of character. Friends began to notice the odd tone, the rushed style that didn't sound quite like Lisa. A close friend even replied with a personal question only Lisa would know, but Ryan ignored it, thinking silence would be safer than stumbling into exposure. Instead of calming suspicions, his silence only sharpened them by evening. Ryan sat in the dimly lit apartment, exhausted but unable to rest. Every sound outside the door sent his heart racing, the squeak of a bicycle, the muffled voices of neighbors, the slam of a car door. He imagined officers arriving at any moment, imagined the knock that would shatter the fragile world he had built. Yet no one came. The neighborhood continued with its ordinary rhythm, unaware of the darkness. Hidden behind the drawn curtains, the stillness of the apartment pressed in on him, thick and suffocating, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the ringing of Lisa's phone. He couldn't bring himself to answer when her sister called again, letting it ring into silence. Knowing every unanswered call was another thread pulling at the web he had woven. The second day ended with Ryan trapped in his own deception. He believed he was in control, but every decision tightened the noose around him. The surveillance cameras that caught Lisa's car, the note at her workplace written in his uneven hand, the credit card charge made recklessly in his own name, all of it formed a trail he couldn't see clearly, but investigators eventually would. He lay awake on the couch that night, staring into the dark, clinging to the illusion that his story still held. But the cracks were spreading, and time was running out. His 48 hours of lies were already half spent, and the truth was inching closer with every breath. On the morning of the third day, suspicion had already started to take root among those who knew Lisa best. Her sister had been calling repeatedly with no answer, each ignored ring tightening the knot of worry in her stomach. Friends were uneasy about the strange messages that didn't sound like her, the abrupt tone and missing details that Lisa never overlooked. It didn't make sense. She wasn't the kind of person who disappeared without explanation, and the silence was too sharp to ignore. By mid-morning, her sister decided she could no longer wait for a reply. She drove to Lisa's apartment. Determined to see for herself, Ryan answered the door with a smile that was too stiff. A greeting rehearsed rather than natural. He claimed Lisa had gone to visit a friend out of town, a story he delivered with calm precision. But his eyes betrayed him, darting toward the closed curtains and the dim interior. The apartment didn't feel right. The air was thick, heavy, with the faint smell of chemicals poorly masking something deeper. The curtains had been drawn so tightly that not a sliver of daylight escaped into the room. In the living room, a rug was oddly placed, stretched unnaturally across the floor as though hiding something underneath. Lisa's sister noticed these details instantly. Even if she didn't fully understand them, Ronnie's grew as Ryan tried. Too hard to reassure her, his voice steady, but his body restless. She didn't linger long. The tension in the apartment was unbearable, and the unease followed her back to her car like a shadow. She pulled out her phone as soon as she left, dialing the police with trembling fingers. Her words tumbled out quickly, her sister missing. The strange behavior of the boyfriend, the smell in the apartment, the locked-up feel of a place that should have been welcoming, was enough to raise alarms. Within hours, patrol cars arrived. At the building, Ryan greeted the officers with the same carefully rehearsed calm, repeating his story that Lisa had taken time away. But his version shifted with each question. At first, he said she had gone to see a friend. Then he changed it, saying she wasn't feeling well and needed space. The inconsistencies piled up, each one a crack in the thin mask he had crafted. The officers listened, their suspicion deepening, and requested permission to enter the apartment. Ryan hesitated, then reluctantly stepped aside. The search began quietly, methodically. Flashlights swept across the dimly lit rooms, catching on. Details Ryan thought he had erased. The faint stains on the carpet, patches that smelled strongly of bleach. The uneven surface beneath the oddly placed ruggle of it spoke louder than his words. In the bathroom, the smell of cleaning products was overwhelming, yet beneath it lingered something metallic and sour. The officers exchanged knowing glances, their instincts telling them this was no ordinary domestic dispute. The living room became the focal point. When they moved the rug, their suspicions hardened into certainty. The floor beneath was stained, poorly scrubbed but still marked by the undeniable evidence of violence. Ryan stood frozen as the officers continued their search, every movement of their flashlights exposing the futility of his 2 days of desperate work. Bags hastily packed with discarded items, surfaces unevenly wiped, and traces of blood in places too small for him to notice all painted a picture of panic and concealment. By the time investigators arrived with equipment, the truth could no longer be delayed. Ryan's composure cracked as the weight of discovery pressed down on him. The carefully constructed lies that had carried him through the first 2 days crumbled in the face of reality. He had believed he was in control, but the evidence was everywhere, impossible to deny. The apartment, which he had tried so hard to turn into a stage for his performance, had betrayed him in silence. The moment the officers secured the scene, the house of cards collapsed. Ryan's 48 hours of deception were over. What he thought was clever manipulation had only left a trail straight back to him. The discovery was no longer a matter of suspicion, it was fact, and fact was something no lie could cover. Ryan had always believed he could talk his way out of anything. For most of his life, small lies had carried him through difficult moments, excuses at work. Stories told to friends, half-truths delivered with enough confidence to pass unnoticed. But standing in the middle of Lisa's apartment as investigators, pulled back curtains, photographed stains, and marked evidence with small yellow tags, he realized there was no way to spin this story anymore. Every second of the past 48 hours had been built on deception, yet all of it collapsed the moment reality broke through. His borrowed confidence drained away, leaving only the raw truth he had tried so desperately to bury. The officers questioned him again, and the cracks widened. He repeated his shifting story about Lisa leaving town, but the words stumbled from his mouth without conviction. His eyes avoided contact, his hands fidgeted constantly, and the tension in his body screamed guilt louder than anything he could say. The questions grew sharper. Where exactly had Lisa gone? Why was her car seen being driven around town without her in it? How could he explain the note at her workplace, written in a hand that barely resembled hers? Each inquiry cornered him, leaving less room for escape. He clung to silence at times, hoping the absence of words might shield him. But silence only deepened suspicion. Meanwhile, Lisa's family had gathered outside the apartment complex there, fear turning into quiet grief as the truth began to settle in their hearts. They knew Lisa would never have vanished willingly. They knew the man standing inside, weaving stories with shaking hands, had something to do with her absence. The sight of police carrying bags of evidence from her apartment shattered any lingering hope. What had once been confusion was now confirmation. Something terrible had happened, and Ryan was at the center of it. The forensic team worked quickly. Swabs collected from the bathroom, fibers lifted from the rug, stains pulled from the carpet, all of it pointed to violence. The bleach Ryan had poured so liberally only drew more attention to the places he had tried to erase. It believed cleaning was control, But investigators saw it for what it was: an attempt to cover a crime. Even the garbage bags he had driven across town betrayed him, pieces of fabric and traces of blood clinging stubbornly to what he thought he had thrown away. Everywhere he turned, the evidence followed. By the time he was escorted to the police station, Ryan was no longer the calm manipulator he had tried to be. The performance had ended, and what remained was a man consumed by fear. In the stark interrogation, Rumi sat hunched, avoiding the gaze of detectives who laid out the timeline of his last 48 hours with unnerving precision. They recounted the text messages, the staged social media post, the drive through town in Lisa's car, the fabricated note. The credit card slip hauled the details he thought were clever had become the very rope tightening around him. Each lie was a breadcrumb leading back to the truth. Outside the walls of the station, news of Lisa's disappearance and the investigation spread quickly. Neighbors who had seen Ryan carrying bags late at night, co-workers puzzled by the strange note, and friends, unsettled by the abrupt messages, all added their voices to the growing story. The image of Ryan and Lisa as an ordinary couple dissolved, replaced by the chilling account of a young woman whose life had been stolen and a boyfriend whose attempt to rewrite reality lasted only 2 days. Ryan's collapse was inevitable. Deprived of control, stripped of his lies, he sat in silence as the detective spoke. The mask he had worn so carefully for 48 hours was gone, leaving only a hollow figure in its place. He had believed deception could buy him freedom, but it had only built a cage around him, brick by brick, until the walls closed in. The chilling truth remained. His attempt to control the narrative ended not with escape, but with his own destruction. In less than 2 days, the story he had written unraveled. Lisa's absence had spoken louder than his words, and the evidence had silenced him completely. The performance was over. The lies had run dry, and the only thing left was the truth he had tried to hide. 48 hours of deception had bought him nothing but exposure, and in the end, it was the lies themselves that sealed his fate.